Good evening. I see let's see, the library company seal, but I'll keep talking. Good evening. My name is Cornelia King, and I am curator of women's history here at the library company. Many years ago, in early 1966, the library company moved to its current location on Locust Street. One of the big incentives to build on this property was the proximity to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, which holds the largest collection of manuscripts in the region. People have joked that some PhD dissertations can even be written just using sources in the two collections. Imagine you'd never have to leave the 1300 block of Locust Street. A very few exceptional resources relate to a great many research topics. As curator of women's history, I believe the standout source in that category is, of course, the Diary of Elizabeth Drinker. Elaine Foreman Crane's excellent 3-volume transcription with its wonderful index is shelved within arm's reach of my desk at the library company. Time and again, I recommend it to our researchers precisely because the text relates to so many things. But the original manuscript is held next door at the Historical Society. Sarah Heim, our speaker tonight, knows firsthand how valuable a source it is for our researchers. Sarah is now running the reading room at the Kislak Center at the University of Pennsylvania after many years at the Historical Society. She was first there as project archivist and most recently as the Historical Society's Director of Research Services. Sarah holds MA and MLS degrees from the University of Maryland in College Park and worked in special collections at the University Library while getting those 2 degrees concurrently. Sarah's own research interests include the history of medical care by and for women from the early 19th century through World War II. Having known Sarah as a neighbor on Locust Street, I can say that she has an extraordinary ability to manage a lot simultaneously with unfailing grace and humor. And I was very grateful when she agreed to be our speaker tonight on the Diary of Elizabeth Drinker and the people who have studied it. So let me turn the show over to Sarah Heim.
Thank you so much, Connie, and thank you everybody for being here. I really appreciate your time. I'm honored to have the opportunity to introduce or reintroduce you to Elizabeth Drinker and her diary, and to give you an overview of how scholars have drawn on it over the past 130 years. All right, thank you for your patience. So I probably first laid eyes on Elizabeth Drinker's diary when I was a project archivist, shelving the second collection I arranged and described at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, this lovely neighbor to the library company that you can see here. That collection was the Irvine Newbold family papers. At that point in 2005, the stacks were crowded, and as I'd unfolded and flattened receipts and separated different family members' letters into separate folders, the amount of space the collection needed on the shelves had increased. To make room for the 77 boxes and 232 volumes recording 5 generations of a Pennsylvania landholding family, I had to close up any tiny gaps I could find between boxes of papers from the Lee and Faberger Publishing Company and from families like the Penns, the Shippens, and the Drinkers. I can't say for certain, but my first reaction was almost certainly one of indifference. I would have been intrigued by the word diary and a feminine name on a battered dark green box, and put off by the fact that on the shelf next to it were bound typescripts and boxes labeled photocopies. My responsibility at the time was to make collections of family papers easier to use, and something that was already copied and transcribed was miles more accessible than many collections. It was not my concern. It was only once I started working in the reading room that I learned how often researchers called them the collection, both in the original and in various surrogate forms. I brought out a volume of the diary to a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and historian and watched her satisfaction at finally seeing for herself the strike-throughs and the abbreviations she'd studied in transcript. And I opened one volume for an undergraduate who sank back in her chair with a look of mingled awe and consternation as she said, "Oh no, it's the actual writing." And I've brought out this image, the only one we have of Elizabeth herself, countless times. Both firsthand and through working with researchers, I've learned just how rich and unusual a source it is. It covers a broader time range than many diaries. The famous British diarist, Samuel Pepys, for example, kept his for only 10 years, while Elizabeth's spans nearly 50, recording the experiences of a young unmarried woman, a mother, and a grandmother. Many 18th century people who had the ability to keep diaries did so for a limited time, as Elizabeth's husband Henry did when he traveled to England to make connections for his import-export business, or with a specific purpose, often religious self-examination. Elizabeth ranged over a broad range of topics, including medicine, politics, religion, and the literal nitty-gritty of 18th century life, like how to eradicate lice. You wash with soap and water and then pour spirits over your hair. Or maintain an outhouse. You have to dig it out every few years, and it's a good idea to burn some incense in the house while this is going on. Elizabeth Drinker lived her whole life with only temporary excursions beyond the Philadelphia area and southern New Jersey, but the changes she saw were remarkable. The very calendar changed when she was 16. When she was a mother with 5 children, the youngest only 3, her nationality changed from British to American. Her city became the capital of a new nation. Her personal life had changes just as cataclysmic, if more common. Her parents died within months of each other. She married and set up a household with her new husband and her elder sister. She gave birth to 9 children, of whom 4 died within their first few years. Her husband was imprisoned. Her oldest son was chronically ill. A daughter eloped. And from the ages of 24 to 73, she returned again and again to noting down, sometimes briefly and sometimes at length, the events of her life in small notebooks she probably made herself. She was born in 1735 to Sarah Jervis and William Sandwith, a prosperous Quaker couple who could provide Elizabeth and her older sister Mary with formal schooling, not only in arithmetic and English reading and writing, but a smattering of French as well. In 1756, Sarah and William died within a few months of each other, leaving Elizabeth and Mary, then in their 20s, without a home. The sisters settled as boarders with a widow, Anne Warner, and her children in a large house on Front Street, and it was there that Elizabeth wrote the first surviving volume of her diary. So Elizabeth wrote very nicely, and this would have been with a quill. It wasn't until steel nibs became a possibility in the mid-19th century that pens as we know them took over from feathers. But you might see why the undergraduate I mentioned was a bit concerned. So in the upper left corner, 1758 is clear. Then under that, it's an abbreviation for October, octo, then a period, and over it a small r. Then something that looks like a Y and a raised small e next to it, and then, oh, thank goodness, a familiar numeral. The superscript abbreviation was just the convention of the day, a sort of shorthand, like we do the A and a circle around it for at in an email address. The Y doesn't mean that she would actually have said ye 8th. She'd have said the. But in the 18th century, a little bit of Old English was still hanging on in writing. Old English had a letter called the thorn for the TH sound. It looked like a P after a hard day. When movable type came along, the first printed works in English were using German type, and German didn't have a thorn. The closest thing those early typesetters could find in their package of German type was a small y. And using a thorn or an approximation held on in written English for a long time in common words like the and that, though not in others. We'll see how in the entry for the 9th, Elizabeth wrote, Empar drank tea with us, and that has a TH, not a thorn. The fact that she says October is an interesting demonstration of exactly where she fell in Quaker practice. Some people, her contemporary Sarah Logan Fisher, whose diary is also at HSP, for example, used number names for months and days instead of the common English names with their references to ancient emperors or Norse gods. Elizabeth said first day, not Sunday, but she used the popular names for the months. You can see, though, that she largely follows another Quaker convention, that of avoiding titles like Mr. or Mrs. in the interests of equality. Everyone gets a first and last name, or a first initial and a last name, except one person who she titles neighbor last name. For most of the diary, she refers to her husband as HD, Henry Drinker, and she will mention herself as ED, Elizabeth Drinker. You also see her religious practice in how often she goes to meeting Quaker worship, not just on Sunday, but on Thursday as well. These first entries are very neatly set off from one another with lines. That convention quickly fades away in a manner that's probably familiar to anyone who's started a diary with an energy that proved difficult to maintain. The entries do continue, though, describing the very pleasant life of a young woman with comfortable resources and few responsibilities. Elizabeth was free to spend time on ornamental needlework, like the flame-stitched Bible cover that provides the visual interest for some copies of her published diary and was the background for our poster tonight. And she also did functional needlework, like knitting stockings. She attended Quaker worship several times each week. There were meetings specifically for women and specifically for young people, as well as the general Sunday meetings. She took walks, drank tea, and visited with friends. Among her closest friends was Anne Swett, later Anne Drinker, who married the rising import-export merchant Henry Drinker in 1757, but in the following year died in childbirth, along with her baby. Perhaps drawn to Elizabeth by their shared grief, Henry Drinker became a frequent visitor to the house, and when in 1759 he made an arduous trip to England to build business connections, he wrote regularly to Elizabeth, and he proposed not long after his return to Philadelphia. The couple married, or as Elizabeth put it in her diary, she changed her name, in January 1761, and they set up housekeeping with her sister Mary and several servants in a house on Water Street, which, as the name suggests, was convenient to the Delaware River and the ships that fueled Henry's business. If you know present-day Philadelphia and are thinking, where's Water Street? Interstate 95 and Christopher Columbus Boulevard now run where Water Street did in Elizabeth's lifetime. Later that same year, she gave birth to her first child, a daughter named Sarah, who they nicknamed Sally. Early married life was so busy, and possibly early pregnancy so exhausting, that Elizabeth made few entries in 1761 and 62. Then she became a brief but consistent diarist, particularly faithful at recording her husband's coming and goings, any medical treatment the family received, and developments with the children. For a long time, I thought it was my own interests that made me feel Elizabeth's accounts of sickness, treatment, and preventative care were such a striking feature of the diary. But in reviewing it for this talk, it's been remarkable how often people are unwell, particularly with bowel complaints, and how unpleasant the treatment sounds. Bloodletting was a common treatment, and even at times like the mid-1760s, when she was not writing much, Elizabeth would make curt notes of 1766, January 11, ED was let blood, perhaps to be sure she could keep track of how often she was getting this treatment. To a 21st century parent, well frightened by reports of how rapidly small children can become dangerously dehydrated, it's terrifying to read of a child with diarrhea and vomiting being subjected to medication designed to cause more of the same. But it was a common practice and often a doctor's advice. As a well-off urban family, the Drinkers had an unusual degree of access to professional medical care, and they had all their children who lived long enough to wean protected from smallpox through inoculation. That is, introducing a comparatively mild case of smallpox by making a small cut in the skin and inserting some infectious material. In 1769, she detailed the procedure she followed for the inoculation of William, her oldest son and third child. Preparation started a week before the planned operation with daily emetic pills, 5 days of emetics, then a day with a laxative, then a day of rest, which the poor kid surely needed. Then Dr. Redmond came with some pus from a patient with smallpox, made a cut on William's leg, inserted the pus, and bound up the wound. And then came a few more days of emetics and anxious monitoring for pox to appear. Elizabeth observed that people who were inoculated seemed to fare much better than those who caught smallpox in the wild, the natural way, she called it. But either way sounds quite terrible. So through the 1760s and early 1770s, Elizabeth was busy tending the family, which by 1771 included 4 children, and the household, while Henry was busy trying to steer a steady course through a very stormy sea of business. The end of the 7 Years' War between France and Britain in 1763 did not bring a hoped-for jump in trade. Rather, the British government sought to cover its war debts with income from the colonies, income raised through taxes on goods including paper, paint, glass, and, most infamously, tea. Henry and his business partner, Abel James, felt that the taxes were wrong, but as Quakers with pacifist convictions, they also deplored the violent protests that broke out against them. This uncomfortable position of being neither fully loyalist nor full protester, but eyed with suspicion by both groups, would become a familiar one. They tried to steer a steady course by joining with other merchants and following an agreement to not import tea and thus not pay taxes. This part is not directly stated in the diary. For Henry's business history at this period, I'm leaning heavily on Dr. Richard Godbeer's examination of other Drinker family papers, particularly Henry's correspondence. Henry and Abel's plan worked well enough that in the early 1770s, they could afford to move to a larger house at a slight remove from the bustle of the docks, a house on Front Street, next door to the Warner House, where Elizabeth and Mary had been living during Henry and Elizabeth's courtship. Then the British government granted a monopoly to the East India Company that would allow the company's agents to sell tea in North America at a price that, even including the tax, would undercut the cost that tea smugglers needed to charge. Abel and Henry took a commission as agents for the East India Company to sell this tea. This was, to put it mildly, not a popular move. Elizabeth's only comment on it was to write, on December 2nd, 1773, AJ and HD sent a paper to the coffee house this evening concerning the tea. That was Henry and Abel pledging not to unload and sell the tea the British had granted them the right to sell. That kept the peace for the moment, but things went harder once the tensions between the government and the colonists came to boiling point. In 1777, the situation came to a head for the drinkers. Henry and 19 other Quakers, whose convictions made them unable to sign oaths of loyalty to the American leadership, were imprisoned. First in the Masonic Lodge in Philadelphia, then, when the British occupation was imminent, in Winchester, Virginia, where they could not have any chance to aid the British. Henry's arrest is where Elizabeth's entries first start to run to multiple paragraphs. She was in great distress, not only on account of her husband, but also because her younger son Henry was seriously ill. Here is her entry from September 12th, 1777, the day after Henry and the others were taken off for Virginia. This has been a day of great confusion to many in this city, which I have in great measure been kept out of by my constant attention to my sick child. Part of Washington's army has been routed and have been seen coming into town in great numbers. The particulars of the battle I have not attended to. The slain is said to be very numerous, hundreds of their muskets lying on the road, which those that made off have thrown down. I was a little fluttered this afternoon by hearing a drum stop at our door and a hard knocking succeed. It proved to be men with orders for HD to appear. Called to see us, J. Drinker and wife, DD and wife, RR Waln and wife, William Redwood, C. West, Dr. Hutchins, Joseph Howell, Dr. Redmond, H. Sansom, Neighbor Stiles, R. Jones, William Norton, A. Parrish, Isaac Foster, S. Sweat, H. Elfrith, S. Fisher, R. Scattergood, E. Scattergood, Suki Hartshorn. You can see how chaotic things were. Henry had been imprisoned, and yet people were still trying to arrest him. She was hearing rumors, had no way to verify them. You can also see from all the names she lists that she had a close community to draw on in this crisis. Henry and the others were imprisoned in Virginia through the winter, while the British occupied Philadelphia. Elizabeth had a British officer quartered in her house. She was not happy to have to share her home with a strange man, though the individual proved to be a fairly reasonable tenant. She and her elder children provided care to American prisoners of war in the city. And along with some other families of imprisoned men, she continued to petition the Continental Congress and the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania to release the Quaker exiles, arguing that there was no evidence that the men had or would materially aid the British forces, and that their absence was a cruel strain on the women and children left behind. In the spring of 1778, Elizabeth joined a small group of women who left Philadelphia to bring their case to General George Washington, then encamped at Valley Forge. Washington, when they arrived, was celebrating the return of Charles Lee, who'd been a prisoner of war for over a year. So Elizabeth and her friends met first with Martha Washington, who she described as a sociable, pretty kind of woman. The general then discoursed with the emissaries, but Elizabeth said, not so long as we could have wished. Washington did grant them passes to travel to Lancaster, where the Continental Congress was sitting, and wrote to Congress recommending the release of the prisoners. When the women reached Lancaster, Congress complied, and they were able to return home to await their husbands. Elizabeth had good reason to be distrustful of the Continental authorities, but she also had little respect for the British occupying forces, who hosted balls and theatricals she saw as frivolous and indeed cruel, given the suffering of people all around who were struggling to find food. When the British left the city in June, she said blandly, "The English have in reality left us, and the other party took possession." After the Revolution, Henry dissolved his partnership with Abel James and dedicated himself to domestic trade and territorial expansion, and particularly explored maple sugar as a domestic alternative to Caribbean sugar. Elizabeth's oldest child, Sally, married in 1787, and in 1788 made Elizabeth and Henry grandparents, ushering in the next phase of domestic life, though parenthood and grandparenthood did merge a bit when a youngest child is born when the oldest is 20. Molly, the youngest surviving child of Elizabeth, was about 14 when she became an aunt. The next marriage, the second child, Anne or Nancy, was in 1791. Also in 1791, Elizabeth's oldest son, William, who had been, in her words, drooping for some time, undertook a journey on horseback in search of health, but instead entered an acute phase of tuberculosis. On October 4th, Elizabeth wrote, "Had letters from Arbonne of New York giving an account of William of WD being ill. He had ruptured a blood vessel in his lungs and was thought to be in danger. I set about preparing for a journey." After some months of careful nursing and not a little bloodletting, in New York, he recovered sufficiently to return to Philadelphia, and he ultimately lived until 1821, though he suffered recurrent attacks of ill health and never married. Just a few years after that health crisis came the famous yellow fever epidemic of 1793. So in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, we tend to associate winter with sickness. So it's striking to realize that in earlier times, it was summer that people worried about getting through without serious illness. The drinkers were usually able to get out of the city in the hottest weather, sometimes over to New Jersey or up to Frankfurt, which is now part of the city, but was then a separate and much less crowded town. Henry would go back to his office regularly with one or both of his sons, depending on William's health, and Mary often stayed to keep house for him. But Elizabeth and Molly, and William, if he was ill, would stay in the countryside. And that's where they were when reports started to reach them of a malignant fever spreading through the city. One of the last researchers I assisted before everything shut down 2 years ago was working on the yellow fever epidemic. And I think about how each day of that week, we stood a little bit further apart in the reading room as we talked about Elizabeth's observations. A fever prevails in the city, particularly in Water Street, between Race and Arch Streets, of the malignant kind. Numbers have died of it. Some say it was occasioned by damaged coffee and fish, which was stored at William Smith. Others say it was imported in a vessel from Cape Francois, which lay at our wharf, or the wharf back of our store. Dr. Hutchinson was ordered by the governor or employed to inquire into the report. He found, as to said, upward of 70 persons sick in the square of different disorders, several of this putrid or bilious fever. All the drinkers did survive the epidemic, and her younger son, Henry Sandwith Drinker, married the next year. In 1795, Molly, the youngest child, was seeing much of a young man named Samuel Rhodes, but Henry disapproved of his business prospects and asked Molly to break it off. Elizabeth thought he had, but on August 10th, 1796, she discovered this was not the case. After candlelight, a young man whom I had no knowledge of, William told me afterwards, it was Richard Jones, came into the back parlor and gave a small unsealed letter into William's hands, then went out as my husband and Robina Miller came back into the parlor. It was directed to Henry and Elizabeth Drinker. I wondered from whom it came, but upon opening it and reading the address at the top, "My dear parents," I cast my eyes down and to my unspeakable astonishment saw it signed Molly Rhodes. I exclaimed something, and no doubt my countenance showed my inward feeling in measure. "What is that?" said my husband. Our visitant said, "I see you have met with something afflicting," and bid us good night. William told me since that, seeing who brought the letter and knowing his sister's hand, observing it was unsealed, that if he had been told that Molly Drinker was dead, he should not have been more shocked. But the subscription of Rhodes took a greater burden from his mind. Not that he had any other particular person in his thoughts, but we did not know that she had seen or spoken to Samuel Rhodes for 6 months past. We had not the least suspicion of anything of the kind occurring. My husband was much displeased and angry, and when I wished to know where she was at present, he charged me not to stir in the affair by any means. What a change from the laconic accounts of activities in her first volume. Much more narrative, much more dramatic, much more of a story. Reading did take up more and more of Elizabeth Drinker's time after her children were grown, though she expressed some moral qualms about the activity, especially fiction. She wrote defensively in 1795, "It looks as if I spent most of today reading, which is by no means the case." But she admitted that, in the greater leisure of grandmotherhood, she read more than she had at any time since her marriage. She indulged a taste for novels, though she usually noted them a bit sheepishly in her diary as silly or trash. She reflected in 1797, "I have often thought that women who live to get over the time of childbearing, if other things are favorable to them, experience more comfort and satisfaction than at any other period of their lives." And though her health was variable, and she sometimes complained of loneliness, it seems that she did experience comfort and satisfaction in her mature years. She died after a short illness on November 24th, 1807. So then what happened to her diary? There are 4 generations between Elizabeth and the Henry Sandwith Drinker born in 1880 who gave the diary to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in 1955. It staggers me to think of how many hands these little volumes passed through, how many times someone picked each one up and had to decide, keep or toss. Her writing was notable enough to those around her that her obituary mentioned it, so it's easy to understand her children valuing it. But grandchildren who knew her only briefly, great-grandchildren who never met her. Henry copied out some entries for the children, but the originals probably returned to whatever drawer or shelf she'd left them on until Henry's death in 1809 led Mary Sandwith and William, the unmarried oldest son, to downsize to rented accommodations rather than continuing to maintain the large house. Dr. Richard Godbeer, in his joint biography of Elizabeth and Henry, has noted references in William's correspondence to the hassle of moving a stash of family papers from place to place. So it seems likely that his oldest son, he was the custodian until his death in 1821. And then the papers passed from the family to the family of his younger brother, Henry Sandwith Drinker, from Henry to his son Sandwith, from Sandwith to his son Henry Sturgis Drinker, and from him to his son, another Henry Sandwith Drinker. If you wonder if archivists sometimes want to go back in time and suggest adding another name or 5 to the family rotation, you are absolutely right. The entire Bible is right there, folks. Can we get a Reuben in here, maybe a Bartholomew? By whatever miracle, the family preserved the diary. Maybe it mattered that when William died in the 1820s, there was a welling up in the United States of concern about memorializing the Revolution. That's the movement that led, for example, to the foundation of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in 1824. It certainly helped that the family was elite, and a clannish pride of heritage seems to have been at play with the first published version of the diary. Henry D. Biddle, a grandson of Elizabeth's younger son, Henry Sandwith Drinker, and a cousin of the Henry Sturgis Drinker, who I surmise is a link in the chain of preservation, was a member of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and had a keen interest in his own family history and in 18th century Philadelphia generally. In 1889, he edited a volume of extracts from his great-grandmother's diary, which was published by Lippincotts. The book received immediate interest from his friends at HSP and from Quaker circles generally. The broader public took notice but was underwhelmed. The New York Times reviewer took Elizabeth to task for not recording Benjamin Franklin's return from France in 1785, while the Dial, a journal that would later publish T.S. Eliot and W.B. Yeats, panned the diary as tiresome and unprofitable, of purely personal character. At the other extreme, Youth's Companion, familiar to Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House readers of Laura Ingalls Wilder, as the magazine that kept the Ingalls family company during the long winter, called it delightful, and the Christian Union comically dry and picturesque. The earliest scholar I've found citing Elizabeth Drinker's diary is William S. Baker, who quoted from Elizabeth's entries about visiting Valley Forge to petition for her husband's release in order to fill out his day-by-day account of George Washington's whereabouts in the winter of 1778. Published in HSP's journal, the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography, in 1891. PMHB also reprinted some extracts from Biddle's extracts, focusing on the Revolutionary period, and a few years later, to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the 1793 yellow fever epidemic, the Friends Intelligencer newspaper published Biddle's extracts covering the epidemic period. The implicit or explicit value scholars placed on the diary at the time was for how it illuminated the experience of great men, or dramatic turning points in history. Elizabeth herself was of interest to her descendants, and her diary was useful for adding color to narratives about this foundation of the country. The next scholarly project using the diary came from another descendant, Cecil K. Drinker, who founded Harvard School of Public Health. He used his great-great-grandmother's diary as the backbone of a series of lectures on colonial American medicine, which he later worked up into a book titled Not So Long Ago, published by Oxford University Press in 1937. He contextualized Elizabeth's practices and experiences by explaining how the ancient theory of bodily humors motivated treatments like bloodletting, and offered his own diagnostic guesses for what ailed various family members. Cecil's sister, Catherine Bowen Drinker, was another writer who in the 1950s wrote a book, Miracle at Philadelphia, about the Constitutional Convention, which made exactly one reference to Elizabeth Drinker in a section about how disease-ridden Philadelphia was and how people were trying to cure skin diseases with rotten apples. Perhaps uncharitably, this suggests to me that she didn't read the diary. She read Cecil's book, and probably not all of it. This is a sidebar, but I can't resist adding that Cecil's brother Philip was one of the inventors of the iron lung that saved so many lives during 20th century polio epidemics. I haven't hunted up any of his papers, so I don't know if his foremother's experiences shaped him at all. It was yet another brother, Henry Sandwith Drinker, who was the custodian of the diary and donated it to HSP in 1955, ensuring scholarly access for the future. His wife, Sophie, who's also in the picture here, had collaborated with historian Mary Beard in attempting to start an archive of women's documents in the 1930s. So she might have been instrumental in pointing out to everyone that the original diary was still important, even though there'd been 2 published versions. Once the diary was at HSP, scholars outside the family started to draw on it. There continued to be history of medicine uses, as when Whitfield J. Bell wrote an article in PMHB in 1957, giving a biography of Dr. Redman, the doctor who had inoculated William Drinker. Bell uses Elizabeth Drinker's accounts to demonstrate Redman's bedside manner and argue that he had been unjustly overshadowed by Dr. Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration of Independence and Redman's sometimes student, because Rush concentrated on publications and Redman prioritized patient care. The budding field of historic preservation also found much to value. In 1969, the newsletter for the Association for Preservation Technology published an article citing Elizabeth Drinker's entry of May 3rd, 1782, saying, "The painter at work this week, painting the roof of our house and back buildings with brick dust." This was part of a survey of the types of sources a preservationist or restorer might consult in trying to identify historically accurate colors and coloring techniques. What these uses had in common was taking Elizabeth Drinker as a reliable reporter, but also having little interest in her herself. That had to wait until women's history and women's studies took off as disciplines in the 1970s. Linda Kerber, in her foundational study, Women of the Republic, recounted Elizabeth's efforts to secure Henry's release in 1778 as an example of female political action, no less real because it was not voting or being elected. Kerber also used Elizabeth's reading habits of later life as part of an argument that reading was an area in which women, those who had the education and the leisure, could express individuality and make choices, activities that might otherwise be limited. Carol Smith Rosenberg, writing at the intersection of medical history and women's history in Puberty to Menopause, The Cycle of Femininity in 19th Century United States, published in the Journal of Feminist Studies in 1973, used Elizabeth Drinker's 1799 Reflections on the Pain of Childbirth the contraceptive possibilities of breastfeeding, and the release of menopause as an example of how women in the 19th century and earlier might have looked forward to menopause as a time of freedom. And then, in the late 1970s, a doctoral candidate named Elaine had, as she later put it, a chance meeting with Elizabeth Drinker in the manuscripts reading room of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Possibly she was running down documents related to Robert Morris, signer of the Declaration of Independence, whose papers she had a fellowship to help transcribe and edit. And she very quickly had the rather revolutionary idea of giving Elizabeth Drinker's writing the same attention that she and her colleagues were giving Robert Morris. When she'd completed her stint with Robert Morris and her dissertation on Newport, Rhode Island and the Revolution, Elaine Crane Foreman assembled funding, staffing, and a great deal of energy to fully transcribe, annotate, index, and publish the complete diary. Even today, with digital cameras and laptops and text search capability, this would be a monumental undertaking. I don't even know how they did the transcription. Only one of my HSP colleagues was there in the 1980s, and he didn't remember. There was an English scholar from the University of Leeds who for many years came to HSP every fall to work on the Cope family shipping records. And he told me how on his first trips, he would bring photographic developing chemicals in his luggage, take film pictures of the documents, and develop them, not print them, in his hotel bathtub each night in order to be sure they weren't blurry. I have to imagine that Dr. Foreman and her team got staff privileges and an office so they could at least use a typewriter, if not an early desktop computer. But beyond the simple task of transcription, there were research problems. There were questions to answer. The diary is a good story, but it's not the whole story. Even when I was giving a view from 30,000 feet, I had to pull in outside information to get us oriented to where Elizabeth Drinker lined up with the timeline of the Revolution. In a 1983 article in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography, that was sort of a teaser for the published diary, Dr. Foreman noted that Elizabeth Drinker said she'd had 9 children, but only 8 were named in the text, so maybe she was referencing a miscarriage. It took subsequent research into Quaker meeting records to find Elizabeth Drinker's 7th child, also named Elizabeth, who was born and died in 1772. Elizabeth Drinker also never mentions her own birth date, and looking up that in the Quaker meeting records raises some new questions. Elizabeth's birth date. That thing I said a little bit ago about the calendar changing when she was 16, here's the entry from the index to the meeting's register of births. So there's Elizabeth in the middle, 12/16/1734/5. What's that about? Up until 1752, in England and Wales, the civil year, the year for legal purposes, began on March 25th. Since the 1580s, however, much of Europe had used a civil year beginning January 1st. There's also a 10-day discrepancy between the March 25th calendar England was using and the January 1st calendar most of Europe was using, which I can explain in the Q&A if anyone would like. So for dates in the months of January, February, and most of March, people would note the last digit with a slash to indicate that, depending on one's preferred calendar, it was 1734 or 1735. So these are the kinds of rabbit holes Dr. Foreman's team had to map, along with differentiating between so many people named Mary and Henry and Samuel. It was fully a 10-year project. The publication came out in 1991. I've chosen the cover of an abridged version because it is more attractive, but the full version came out in 1991 to impressed and appreciative reviews. It's striking to me that the reviews in the American Historical Review and the Journal of American History both note the published edition as helping to fill a great gap in accessible primary source documents on the experience of non-founding fathers. It's the review in the then fledgling Journal of Women's History that asks, what's the significance of women's diaries with their repetitive accounts of daily activities? And doesn't ask, why has no one ever questioned the significance of George Washington's post-retirement diaries, which are incredibly repetitive? Reigned today, mended saddle. That's most of 1798 for George. Maybe his war papers are more exciting, but the retirement diary is what HSP owns, and I've got to tell you, it's a snooze. So there was still, around 1990, a sizable helping of insecurity around women's history as a discipline that Dr. Foreman was swimming upstream against in giving so much attention and effort to this single document. But the subsequent 30 years have shown how this single document can help fill in gaps beyond just what was it like to be a wealthy Quaker woman. While in the 1890s, George Baker called on Elizabeth Drinker to fill in any tiny fragment of George Washington's life that had gone unrecorded, in the 1990s, Alice and Duncan Hirsch used the diary to illuminate the experience of mixed race people in Philadelphia in the 18th century. Hirsch listed 19 individuals, some named and some unnamed, that Elizabeth Drinker identified as mulatto in the diary, traced how references to people of mixed race increased in the 1790s, and noted how that reflected changing demographics in the city. In the 2010s, and now we get to the research I was actually there for, Marla K. Miller of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst completed an examination of the legend of Betsy Ross, using the diary, among other HSP sources, to piece together the life of Elizabeth Griscom Ross Ashburn Claypool. The Griscoms were of a lower social class than the Drinkers, and the diary records Betsy's sister Rachel, who, like her sister, was an upholsterer and seamstress working for the Drinkers in the 1790s, sewing mattresses for the family beds. Again, Elizabeth's observations allowed scholars to trace the lives of people who had little or no opportunity to record their own experiences, or those whose records did not survive. In 2019, Dr. Richard Godbeer published a joint biography of Henry and Elizabeth, World of Trouble, that used the diary as well as their letters and those of other family members in a far-reaching examination of the messy human ramifications of the revolution. The in-between pacifist stance of the Drinkers, neither loyalist nor patriot, makes their family a fruitful vantage point for examining the turbulent years of the late 18th century. For both Dr. Miller and Dr. Godbeer, I should say, Dr. Foreman's work meant the diary was the easy part of the research. They both had to patiently comb through old-fashioned card catalogs and inventories to identify letters, and especially financial ledgers, and then even more patiently comb through the volumes themselves, looking for those cryptic notations like 1 shilling 2 pence to R. Gris for mattress. That to me meant nothing, but to Dr. Miller meant, aha, the Griscoms were still in the upholstery business at that date, so Betsy could have been in a place for someone, say a general, to walk into the shop to ask for a flag. The earliest scholarship drawing on the diary considers Elizabeth herself only instrumentally, as if she were a camera and the content of the photograph is what's interesting, particularly when what is in the photograph is a founding father. Starting in the 1930s, scholars found great value in the evidence Elizabeth's work offers about illnesses, medical treatment. But with the tremendous boost to access brought by Dr. Crane and her team's nearly 10 years of work transcribing, annotating, and publishing the full diary, scholars have been increasingly attentive to the prose itself and Elizabeth Sandwith Drinker as an individual and a writer. It's also been increasingly possible to mine the diary for evidence of other lives, less privileged than Elizabeth's, particularly the lives of people of African descent or mixed race, or white servants. Most recently, as in during COVID times, I was lucky enough to assist researchers who sought Elizabeth Drinker's aid to understand access to drinking water in 18th century Philadelphia, or trace the history of a hitherto unexamined type of shell art that complicates our ideas of Quaker simplicity. Some avenues I haven't seen explored and which I hope to see in the future is possibly a disability studies analysis, particularly of the ways Elizabeth and her oldest son, William, negotiated each in turn being caretaker and cared for in the last years of her life. It would be amazing to see someone take advantage of technology for a fully hypertext version of the diary, linking out to maps and finding aids for other collections. And this semester, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania is piloting a project with the University of Pennsylvania to have history professors teach classes at HSP using HSP sources. And I think the diary would be an amazing background for a history course. Finally, I'd like to close with a small plug for my colleagues, present and future, by asking all of you to consider the possibility of being the heirs of Elizabeth Drinker, if you choose to retain your own documents or those of your family. In the electronic age, it's a choice that requires more action, since Google Drive is a lot more unpredictable than paper is. But if you're clearing out a relative's attic or helping a friend tidy up after a family death, don't be too quick to think that there's nothing of value in Aunt Myrtle's letters. Even, or as Elizabeth Drinker demonstrates, maybe especially, if the first one you see starts out with, "Stayed at home all day." Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was wonderful. I'm going to clap just to the audience is hidden from view. We are getting some comments in the chat. Denise says wonderful. Patricia says fascinating. And if you haven't already posted a question, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. And you're also welcome and encouraged to place a question in the chat. I will find it there as well. We do already have 2 questions lined up. So I will begin with Robert Kettle. Robert asks, how did she get a state historical marker on 2nd Street?
Oh, okay, that's a, so I think I'm just trying to picture that marker. I think that may be kind of around the block from, because her house on Front Street ran pretty far back. So what if the question is, why is it on 2nd Street, not on Front Street? Which was the sort of the mailing address. I'm guessing that was wherever that was the part of the property that the Historical Commission was able to find the space to put it up in. That's my best guess.
Great. And Michelle Flamer asks, did Elizabeth Drinker ever write about abolitionism? I thought the entry about maple sugar as an alternative to sugar cane was interesting. Also, does the book published about early medicine acknowledge Onesimus, forgive me if that is not the correct pronunciation, the enslaved African man who introduced the smallpox vaccine to Cotton Mather?
Oh, that's a great question about the vaccination. I don't think it does, but I'm not 100% sure. And about abolitionism, so Quakers were in a lot of turmoil on the issue at that time. And so late in life, when Elizabeth was writing more reflective entries, she mentioned that her parents had enslaved at least one person, a little girl named Jude or Judy. And after her parents died, Elizabeth and her sister did sell this little girl. And almost immediately they did wish they hadn't and tried to buy her back to free her. And the person they sold her to wouldn't do it, but they actually remained in contact with Jude, and she came to visit Elizabeth a few times later in life, possibly asking for help. And Elizabeth definitely, these couple entries where she talks about her history with Jude and her history having been someone enslaving this little girl. She did feel a lot of guilt about that, and would also sort of justify it to herself, saying, well, nobody said anything against owning slaves at that point, because the trajectory in the 18th century of the Philadelphia Monthly Meeting of Quakers was around 1750. They said, don't buy or sell slaves. They didn't say don't own them. And then it's only later in the century they actually said, okay, actually, if you are enslaving people, you should free them. And then in the 1790s, also finally getting to the point of saying, yes, Black people can in fact become full members of Quaker meetings as well. So that's an excellent question, and it's a heavy topic.
Our next question is from Roger Moore. Since transcribed, are the diaries in a format that is searchable? Also, do you know whether the diaries refer to the Philadelphia riots of 1740 and 1753 due to the flood of counterfeit coppers into the city?
Wow.
Copper Panic of 1789.
Wow. 1789.
Or the huge devaluation of the continental currency during the Revolutionary War. So I think there are a lot of questions in that question about currency.
Can you actually, Blanche, is there a way can you make it so I can see the question? I just want to make sure I get all the pieces. So a searchable format, yes. So there is, so in the published book, there is an amazing index that covers a huge array of things, but also in a database by the company, I think Alexander Street. They have a full text searchable version. So that's a subscription database, but it's probably available if you by going to an academic library. Often, if you have your own device and get on their Wi-Fi, sometimes you can access things like that. And so a fully searchable version does exist, and the index access in the publication, the 3-volume diary, is amazing. The riots of 1740 and 1743, no, because the diary we have starts in 1758. I'm not sure about the copper panic of 1789. I do know devaluation of currency definitely is something that comes up just as part of her general stress, especially while her husband was imprisoned. That part of the general suffering of not being able to access food, or not being able to buy clothes, is you also don't have anything to buy it with, because the currency is because the continental currency isn't worth very much.
And Connie put a question in the chat, which I will read. Sarah, thank you so much for giving us an excellent overview of this source and the people who have studied it. Can you say more about how the little diaries were constructed?
Sure. So I actually have a Marvel movie style post-credit scene extra slide. So we'll see if the sharing will work. Sharing will work faster this time. Each one is about 40 pages, and that I think what she did was she would get a large sheet, probably in the 11 by 17 sort of size, and cut it down and then fold it in half, and then on the seam punch holes and sew through with thread, and cover it with frequently just brown paper, but occasionally paper that then she would paint a design on. And I'm gonna try sharing one more time. Okay, well, I hope I described it.
But thank you everyone for your patience.
Yeah. So I see someone asking, given the availability of the transcription, do researchers still use the original? And if so, why? So the original is one of very few items at HSP that the staff does ask people to, that there is a little, for most things at HSP, anyone who can come in and do research and ask to see the original anything. These diaries, because there is such a good transcription, will ask people to use the transcription first, but then if someone says, even if someone just says, it would just feel really cool to be able to look at this entry in which she's talking about her guilt for having sold the little enslaved woman, the young enslaved girl, we would bring it out. We would bring it out for people to see. And people do sometimes want to see the original because there are places where the transcription does note something was scratched out, or there's an abbreviation. And sometimes either people may feel like, well, maybe Elaine Foreman couldn't figure it out, Foreman Crane couldn't figure it out, but I can figure it out. Or sometimes new information can come out that collections that weren't fully described in the 1980s may come along, and someone may say, oh, this name that was tagged as unknown, now we say, oh, that person has a whole cache of papers out at Swarthmore now, and so now we can draw some new connections. So those are some of the reasons someone might still want to go back to the original.
Thank you. And Christine Smith asks, do you know who painted the portrait of the couple under the arch that I believe appeared in the slide?
Oh, in the picture of the reading room, Benjamin West, and the picture is of oh my goodness, I'm forgetting the man who built the Woodlands Estate and Woodlands Cemetery in West Philly, and his niece. Hamilton, thank you.
And Molly asks, do we know the area her summer season home was located in, just outside of Philly? Does it still stand? And are there thoughts to have an archaeological dig near either of her homes?
Oh, that's a great question. And I think so there wasn't one consistent one. There were a few different places they went. And I'd have to look up, I know there was a property in Frankfurt for quite a while, but I'm not sure if there's been any archaeology or if there are plans for that.
And Michelle Flamer asks in the chat, is the transcription available online at HSP?
Not as HSP didn't have a subscription to that database as of November 5th. I don't know what's happened since then. So it could be, and there is, if you go to hsp.org, there is a button at the top where you can click to submit a question. And Mondays and Fridays, around the middle of the day, there are librarians standing by to answer your question in real time. So that is the way to find the up to the minute answer on what's available, what electronic resources are available at HSP.
Perfect. And Ned Drinker asks, can you elaborate on the relationship of HD and sister-in-law Mary Sandwith?
So good question. So some people have, in fact, theorized that Henry may have, been a little, been not quite sure which sister he wanted to propose to. That after the day that, and it's interesting, Elizabeth doesn't straight out say, Henry proposed last night. She just says something like, oh, I shall never forget this evening. But then the next day she says, oh, HD came and talked to Mary in the parlor for a while. So the idea of Mary making her home with them was part of the relationship from the very beginning. And there's been some scholarship done about sibling relationships that's looked at Elizabeth and Mary, but just the whole setup interestingly complicates our ideas about the immortal nuclear family for all time of two parents and various children. That it's never been that straightforward in many things. Oh, and Ned Drinker, thank you so much for correcting me on the pronunciation, that it's Cecil in the family. That is very good to know.
And Jay Stifle asks and says, outstanding presentation. Thank you, Sarah. Have any British historians made use of those portions of the diary pertaining to the occupation of Philadelphia?
I haven't worked with any who did. That's not to say that it hasn't happened. Oh, I suppose I should say, so Richard Godbeer, though an American resident, possibly an American citizen, that's a personal question I have not asked, but he is by heritage an Englishman. So he has, yeah, that would be an interesting analysis. Most of the citations I've found to scholarship about it are American publications, but that also doesn't mean anything necessarily about the nationality of the writers. There was the British Medical Journal did have a review of Cecil Drinker's book when it came out. So that does show a certain interest.
And Sophie Jones says, thank you so much for this fascinating insight into Elizabeth's life. After this talk, I would love to purchase a copy of the edited version for myself. Could you speak a little about how the abridged version compares to the full version?
Sure, that's a great question. So the abridged version, and I also should specify, so there's a 19th century abridged version that was edited by Henry Biddle, her descendant, and then there's a 20th century abridged version edited by Elaine Crane Foreman, who also led the project to publish the full thing. So the abridged, the 20th century version explicitly focuses on demonstrating the sort of the life stages of an 18th century woman. And so some of the, actually, I'm going to grab the, I have my copy here. But so the introduction to that talks a lot about what the selection criteria were for editing it down. And so the, some of the, you know, a lot of the notations about weather came out, and some of the, you know, responses about reading, and some of the politics in favor of, you know, just having that lifespan picture. And the 19th century edited version was much more focused on any time she got within 2 streets of a founding father. That one is, I think, available for free on the Internet Archive.
Great, good to know. I think we have time for one last question, and the one I saw first was a follow-up from Ned Drinker about the death in 1824 of H.D.'s son, Henry Sandwith Drinker.
I don't off the top of my head, but that would also be something worth chatting, you know, messaging HSP's reference line, because there is a fairly extensive collection of Drinker family papers, and so those the subsequent generation may be well covered there. And also HSP has an enormous genealogy collection, so that they would also be able to find other threads to pull on to learn more about the death of Henry Sandwith Drinker.
Wonderful. Well, I think that closes our Q&A portion for the evening. Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us. Connie, any closing words?
Excuse me. Not a lot, except to say happy Women's History Month. And I am so happy that we have our Locust Street resources. And that all of you have joined us. I think when I saw 73 people at one point were online, and that's a wonderful outcome for the kind of plans we make so far in advance to see you all here. Thank you for joining us, and thank you again to Sarah for a wonderful presentation.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Have a good night, everyone.